Good morning. Welcome. Welcome to our study of the excellent path of enlightenment. Kuzuzombola. So today I'm broadcasting from Sydney. It's a little bit cold here. Benvenuto. All right. So kindly generate the attitude of wishing to apply this in a way that we can benefit all sentient beings. It's quite important that we begin our study with the attitude of bodhicitta, because the way that we're hearing things will be very different, and also the subject. Try and imagine the subject who is listening. If there's a sense of grappling from the point of view of our ordinarily confused subjectivity, just gaining information, we have a very different attitude than if we have that sense of responsibility that we're here, we're in some way connecting with our lineage, our family of our family from the point of view of our abiding, existing, enlightened disposition, our Buddha nature. So from that point of view, connecting with that aspect of ourselves, and that which is that you could say genuine ground that is our basic family, and from that point of view, taking up the heritage and the you could say the responsibility that we've inherited as bodhisattvas, then the way that we approach the path and listen is very different. So that magnanimity is we should generate at the outset of our study. So we are presently looking at the outer preliminaries. We have here on our left side the 11th Dzogchen teacher, and this is Ngöndro. It says 11th in the place of the Vajra throne, the source of enlightenment, the truly perfected Father King taught a retinue of lords of the three family the teachings that were exclusively the definitive meaning. This was during the time when a lifespan could last 300 years. And actually, I just point out some of the persons here in our lineage. Oh, sorry, the masters around Ngöndro Gyalpo. This is an iconographic representation of Jamyang Rinpoche. This is the first Drurupchen. I think it is. It says Jigme Chinle Palbar, but I think it might be the first Drurupchen. We usually say Jigme Chinle Öse. Over here we have a king called Ngagi Wangpo, who was a great clan leader in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And this is his student, Shabkat Sokdo Ngondro, who was a great master whose life story has been translated. It's a wonderful read. And I think this is Sokdo Ngondro's student, Pema Gyamso. And this is a great woman practitioner, Anilochen Cheni Zangmo, who then lived up until from the mid 1800s until the mid 1900s. So basically mid 19th century to mid 20th century. So she died in 1953 or something, but she was very old, lived ripe old age, and also was very, very great master. And she lived just outside Lhasa. You can still visit her monastery, which is also where Longchenpa for many years was in retreat. It's called It'll come to me. Anyway, the monastery is right outside Lhasa, and then another student here. But she was incidentally also, I think, one of the teachers of the late Kyabje Rinpoche. Anyway, a little bit about the lineage masters around the 11th Dzogchen teacher, Ngondro Gyalpo, truly perfected Father King. So presently, what's that? Yeah. So presently then, in the Ngondro, we're looking at the preliminary reflections. So we looked last time at the opportunity of having been born a human, having all these advantages and these freedoms and advantages. And now looking at death and impermanence. Khyentse Rinpoche says, to have obtained this human birth is not enough. At any moment, death may take it away from us. How and when we shall die are completely uncertain. No one can say, I will live this many or that many years or months. Any of the daily events in our lives, like walking, eating, playing, crossing a river, and so forth, could turn out to be the cause of death. So we say, death is certain, how we die is uncertain. So it could be at any given time, obviously, and under any of the regular circumstances we engage in. Impermanence affects not only living beings, but the outer universe as well. So one way that we, and you also see this in the words of my perfect teacher, we contemplate we contemplate impermanence through looking at the outer universe, the seasons. We look at all the great beings that have been within the universe, all the historical figures that are now only names, and we look at all the people around us. So Khyentse Rinpoche says, the world seems very solid to us, but at the end of the kalpa it will be destroyed by fire and water. Throughout the seasons of the year we can see how the mountains, forests, and the various features of the landscape change from day to day, from month to month. Every hour of every day, the weather, the light, the river flowing before our eyes are never the same. As each instant passes, everything changes. Nations are powerful for a period of their history and later are conquered by other nations. Within a single lifetime, people who are immensely rich can end up utterly destitute. So no aspect of the outer phenomenal world is permanent or certain. Why do we need to reflect again and again on impermanence? We have a strong tendency to think that we and all the conditions in which we live will last, to think that there is some inherent presence in them. Because of this, we cling strongly to outer phenomena. This is a mistake. If instead we constantly reflect on impermanence, we will have a powerful incentive for turning to the Dharma. We need to be constantly aware that from the very moment we are born, we come closer and closer to death. There is no way to avoid death. With each day that passes, our lives are running out. When the time comes for us to die, even if we're very powerful, we cannot possibly persuade death to wait. However rich we are, we cannot bribe it. The mightiest of generals cannot send an army against it. Even if we are very beautiful, we cannot seduce it. Whatever we do, death cannot be stopped. The reflection on death is quite interesting because it's something that's obvious. There's nothing here that in some way doesn't make sense. What contemplation on death really comes with is a humble recognition that we don't recognize death, that we can hear about death and yet it's something that surprisingly doesn't really get a hold on us. So we can study subjects like Madhyamika and in general philosophy. Some of these things require actually a fair bit of thinking and a fair bit of pondering and contemplating. Not necessarily that easy to understand right away. Death and impermanence is easy enough to understand, but what really comes up here is the degree to which we forget it. And so the teachings that we have here, they're not teachings where we can go to our friend and say, I really don't understand this. Can you explain this to me? Because we have that with a lot of the other teachings. So this is something that we're actually left with ourselves about. This is very intimate. We can and we do to some extent, I guess, sit and ponder with our friends how life is passing by very quickly. But the actual the value of it really lies in our own recognition, our own humble, intimate, very personal recognition. And it's not as if it's one of these things where we say, yes, now I understand, because it's something that we understand, but it's more about the depth of our understanding. How deeply does it really sink into our perceptions? And that's why all of this here in some ways is quite self-explanatory, but at the same time, it's something we shouldn't be fooled by its apparent obviousness. At the moment of death, nothing but the Dharma will be of any use. Of all the fears we experience in this life, there is none greater than the fear of death. So to be ready for death, we should not wait until the last moment to practice the Dharma. If we want to practice the Dharma now, we can. But at the time of death, we'll not be able to. We'll be overwhelmed by physical pain and mental anguish. That is not the time to start thinking of practice. So like an intelligent person who plans ahead, get ready right now to face death with the firmness that comes from mature practice. So here again it applies that it's not about us being afraid of death. It's not as if we live in the shadow of death and we're not able to, there's sometimes these critiques that the teaching on impermanence, and particularly the teaching on rebirth and taking responsibility and planning, like Rinpoche is saying here, planning for what comes next. These teachings are not intended to instill fear. They're just they're taught in order to provide a happiness for us so that we're prepared, so that what comes next, we have already created the conditions. So at that time we can die without worry. So all of these have a very intelligent, obviously intelligent, but they really they do not come from a place of fear. They rather just come from from a perspective of being sensible, planning ahead. Like we save up for our old age, or we make sure that our children get a proper education. We plan ahead. And we should do that as Buddhists. Doesn't mean understanding impermanence of death doesn't mean we don't plan. It doesn't mean that but rather it just means that we're prepared, that things don't last, things happen unexpectedly, and so forth. So with that recognition, then it's about having the opportunity right now and making sense of it, or making use of it. Rinpoche goes on to say, do not waste a single moment, like a warrior who pierced to the heart by an arrow knows that he has only a few moments to live. It is now, while we're in good health and in possession of all our physical and mental faculties, that we should practice the Dharma. We must not postpone it thinking, I will practice later. I'm going to practice this weekend. I'm going to practice later today. Maybe this afternoon I'll do a session of meditation, or later this morning. Rather, it should be something that we immediately apply, we click into. We should realize that death is a very frightening event for those who are not prepared for it. We must not think, I have so many years ahead of me. The food we have just eaten could turn out to be poisonous and make us die tonight. Examples of the causes of unexpected death are many. We can see them all around us. Impermanence can be found in all aspects of life. People who have attained high status can suddenly find themselves in humble positions. Many of those who have amassed a lot of money will later lose it. No one remains wealthy forever. Those who have formed strong attachments to family and friends will be separated from them sooner or later. If not then, If not now, then certainly at the time of death. So very often when we're speaking with friends and so forth, we miss this point. So much of the discourse that we have in common conversations and in our culture is about this view of permanence. These people come from old money. This person is rich. We don't say this person is for the time being rich, or temporarily somebody's born into a family of wealth. We don't say like that. We say this person is rich, that family is rich, and this conglomerate, exists as such, but everything is so much more fluid than we generally speak about it. Once we are aware of the constant threat of death, we will not want to continue the meaningless activities in which we have been so heedlessly engaged day after day. So practically speaking, us who do not live in a renunciant situation like a retreat or in a monastic situation, this doesn't mean then that we, for us, it probably doesn't apply that we discontinue our activities. It more means that whatever we're doing, we imbue it with practice. We bring practice into the situations. We meet whatever happens with meditation. So from that point of view, then, our immediate experience needs to be engaged with practice. We cannot just think about practice as that which we do when we sit down in sessions and so forth. Of course, sessions enable us to practice better, and there we have less disturbance. But unless we integrate what we're practicing in the session in everyday activity, it won't. The teaching, of course, the practice, of course, will have value. So it's not wasted, but really the value of practice only begins to really take on traction within our being when we're integrating the two, meditation and post-meditation. And this recognition of impermanence then is really the key incentive for enthusiastically engaging in this unified practice. The third reflection is then on karma, the law of cause and effect. If death was simply like a fire going out or like water drying up, everything would be fine. There would be little use in practicing the Dharma. But this is not what happens. When the mind and the body separate, the body is left behind, but the mind goes on to take many more rebirths. At that point, only one thing determines where our next life will be. That is the balance of positive and negative actions committed in the past that are embedded in our consciousness. If negative actions predominate, we will experience the suffering of rebirth in the lower realms. If positive actions predominate, we will experience rebirth in the higher states of existence. Now, sometimes in modern Buddhism, we'd like to say that, or people would like to say, oh yeah, well, the whole teaching of rebirth is premised on some culturally conditioned views and practices that are not necessarily what the Buddha said. And that's a rather confused and extremely flawed view, because if we look at, let's say, the Pali Canon, it's full of references to rebirth. And they're not just spoken of as just an aside, as part of engaging the audience. The point is that we will die, and what we experience presently will continue. And also we have then the materialist view on consciousness, that is something that's produced from matter. Again, it is something which in contemporary and neuroscience and all these quarters is understood as the hard problem of science. There's a lot of insight in neuroscience, but they're all what we call things that address the soft problems of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness, humbly recognized within the field of neuroscience, is that we actually don't understand and know what consciousness is, basically. And so as much as we have a wonderful science material from materialist science on the objective phenomenal world in terms of matter, mind is not understood. The Buddhists and the Buddha and the sages since the Buddha do understand consciousness. And they do not in any way sort of subscribe to some of the ideas that consciousness could emerge out of stuff. Consciousness, as we experience, comes from previous moments of consciousness. And all of this is a display of an intangible mind that, while it cannot be found, manifests. And so within that experience of our consciousness, then there's a place where we go wrong, misunderstand mind, and take this expansive consciousness to be a self and what is perceived as other. And that's what sparks off then the cycle of rebirth. Now, some people might say, well, it's all just dependent arising, and I needn't actually think of this because I won't be the same person. Well, no, that's true in some way, but at the same time, the sense of I, that continues. So while you could say in the absolute, yes, we're dependently arisen, the non-existent phenomenon of mistakenly attributing a self to this, you could say, river of dependently arisen phenomena, that remains until it has actually been uprooted. And that's where we then are conditioned by the positive and negative actions. And that's where we continue to create these various experiences of these 6 realms. So that's why we should understand, of course, what we're talking about here completely. But then we should really also, while that is something we can say, oh yeah, okay, I get it. Then we actually, the real, what we take from this is then, again, like we understanding impermanence, then we also understand we need to prepare for the future. Of course, yes, ultimately we want to go beyond karma, but as long as we are not free of this delusion that drives samsara, then we are subject to karma. We are subject to the projections of this confused mind. So this is where we continue to experience a sense of an individual person and a space that we experience as a realm. So Khyentse Rinpoche goes on to say, it is not on our deathbed or in the bardo that we should start to think about positive and negative actions. We may very well recognize at that time that negative actions are the cause of our suffering, and that we would be happier if we had done positive deeds. But when we're dying, there's nothing much we can do. Our karma has already built up. It is now, when we have the freedom to choose between what we should do and what we should not do, that we must consider the law of karma. It is a serious mistake to think that we can do whatever we want, good or bad, and that by practicing a little dharma on the side, we will be able we will be taken to enlightenment as though by airplane. Again, this is not about fear. It's just about recognizing that right now we have all the conditions there, so we should make use of them. In the bardo, even if we regret all our negative actions, it's too late. Karma has been accumulated and nothing can stop us falling like a stone thrown in the air. We cannot reverse the process. So it's now we must be able to recognize and discern positive and negative actions. Even if a positive action seems insignificant, we should do it. It's interesting with our mind that it doesn't really take much for us to shift. If we have a sort of a dull moment or a negative moment, it's surprising how little it actually takes for us to shift that. So there's never be a moment that we think, oh, well, I'm going through this and eventually I'll deal with it. There's actually not a single moment where we cannot change this, but it does require wholeheartedness. We cannot sort of be, oh yeah, Dharma is like one of the things, the many things I do in my life. Like he's saying, we do a little Dharma on the side. This is more important than anything. And this is what creates our present experience as much as the future also. But if we in the present moment engage and begin to see how powerful the application of the Dharma is in terms of our immediate experience, then we cease to be overwhelmed by the conditions of our life, and we begin to gain some confidence in the practice. And this will help us. So even if a negative action seems trivial, we should avoid it. So we might have the habit of just doing something that's negative, and we just seem that it's not a big deal, but it is actually. If we have the habit of throwing garbage out our window, then after a while we look outside. It'll be quite, maybe it's just little things, just little pieces of paper or whatever, or garbage we throw outside. After a while we look, it'll be quite substantial. I don't think many people do that, but it's a bit like that when we also have little moments of irritation, and we just sort of tend to just like be tough. And then after a while, it becomes part of who we are. Or if we're dull or indulge ourselves and we just think, oh, this is fairly innocent, after a while, it becomes a deeply embedded habit. Water dripping for a long time can fill a huge basin. A single spark can set fire to a mountain of grass. Likewise, every action has its result. Never think that a minor action leaves no trace. So this applies both to the good and bad. With a little negative actions, this accumulates, but also with any given situation, to begin to mix or bring in Dharma in any situation has also a profound effect on us. On the other hand, we should not think that negative actions we have done need mark us forever. However heavy our negative actions may be, they can be purified. There is nothing that cannot be purified. So we must regret and repair all our negative actions. As we have said, since small drops of water can fill a huge vessel, we must constantly endeavor in daily life to use our body, speech, and mind for positive actions. This will build up an accumulation of merit and virtue that will help us when we're faced with the fear of death. So also we needn't think that success in Dharma practice is only for special people. It's for us. It's just about us actually doing it. Problem is, in our modern culture, it's a little bit unusual. And that's why we probably, for the time being, need to very much look at Tibetan practitioners. And as much as we have great lamas that come and visit in various places, sometimes I think it's quite helpful if we go to Asia and just see how ordinary people practice. It's profoundly inspiring. Sometimes what happens with us is that we project. And I've seen persons who live in Asia, and they end up always seemingly and surprisingly fixating on the gossip and the negative aspects. And sure, that's like anywhere. So if we go and live with Asians, yes, we can sort of go, oh yeah, they have this habit of gossip and this and that, or these intrigues. But personally, I went to Asia to study Buddhism and to not get involved in all the things that you have anywhere you have always anywhere. What my objective when I went to Asia was studying the teaching, and apart from also attending teachings with Tibetan teachers, also looking at how the society operate, how the adults interact with the children, how you have what I would call hidden yogis and yoginis, practitioners that you might not notice, who don't have a name at all. And I found many. Might be I'm just naive and dreaming and whatnot, but I found many persons that I thought had this, what we're talking about here, applied the teachings so they would be able to meet confidence with death. And I would argue even some people, really great realized beings, even though no name and no reputation and so forth, men and women who are profoundly inspiring. So we shouldn't think that it's about you being a tulku or being a special person and so on. It's really just about doing it. The magnitude of positive and negative actions does not depend upon how they appear from outside. It's easy to accumulate great positive karma or great negative karma with a small action. It all depends upon our intention or attitude. For example, to help someone in a small way, but with great loving kindness, will accumulate a lot of positive karma. Likewise, a single word, easily uttered, may accumulate boundless negative karma if, for example, it's used to criticize a bodhisattva. So again, so much about the attitude, not about the action itself. The great condition of beings in samsara is one of delusion, a state that always produces suffering. Now that's where Khyentse Rinpoche, he says, we're so often trying to eke out a little sort of manage somehow in samsara to get what we want. The image of piling up the strawberries. You can put one strawberry on top of another strawberry. Try and putting the third one. And that's how, and even if we do it doesn't last long before it falls down. And Rinpoche, he says, you can never fix samsara. You can never find anything that's really worthwhile in samsara. Why? Because you're constantly operating from this delusional sense of me that is entirely founded on a deluded and toxic, basically completely dysfunctional place. So we can work with this presently, but Khyentse Rinpoche goes on to say, if we ignore our negative actions and do nothing to purify, confess and repair them, we shall gradually accumulate negative karma. We shall not be able to receive the blessings of the Buddhas and spiritual teachers, neither shall we be able to develop spiritual experience and realization. So we can't ignore negative actions. Again and again we hear how at the end of the day, as practitioners, we'd want to just recognize, look back, analyze the day, see how we did, if bodhicitta has increased, and if it hasn't, what was it that obstructed it, and purify, chanting Vajrasattva, do whatever we would want to do, making a resolve to improve. We need, therefore, Khyentse Rinpoche says, to be constantly aware and mindful of the difference between virtuous and non-virtuous actions, to cultivate the former and avoid the latter. So this is, as long as we are caught by by liking good circumstances and disliking bad circumstances, as long as we don't have realization, then we're caught by these circumstances of good and bad. When you wake up in the morning, think, not only have I the good fortune to have been born a human being, but I have entered the door of Dharma. I have met a spiritual teacher and received his instructions. So today I shall put my best to follow the Dharma and practice only what is positive. This I shall do not only for my own sake, but for the benefit of all beings, without a single exception. So we shouldn't have any kind of doubt that we could have this kind of attitude. We shouldn't think, oh, I can't do it. We should think like that. This is our ground, and that's why we can appreciate great bodhisattvas, because we have that within ourselves. So we shouldn't be overwhelmed and by our own shortcomings, but develop this kind of courage. And as far as our own shortcomings go, it's very helpful to practice meditation. With the practice of meditation, then we tend to be less prone to be deceived by and carried away by our thoughts. We don't have instant realization, but bit by bit we begin to be less naive about the way that our conceptual mind tricks us into thinking, this is how I am. These thoughts are so serious and so real. So with the practice of meditation, we train in letting go. And that's where we begin to be less prone to think of ourselves exclusively in terms of our confused aspect. And we begin to have a bit more confidence in the purity that's basic to who we are. And that's where it becomes a bit easier then to have this kind of thought. May I benefit all beings with everything I do. When it is time to rest in the evening, examine everything that you have thought, said, and done during the day. If you have done something positive for yourself or others, you should rejoice. Dedicate the merit to all sentient beings and pray by this merit they may all attain enlightenment. Make a wish that the next day you may cultivate even more virtuous actions. If you realize you have lapsed into negative action, think, I have this precious human birth, I have met a teacher, and yet this is how I behave. You must feel strong regret and determine not to make such mistakes again. To acquire mindfulness, we need to constantly examine our intentions and actions. It does not even occur to ordinary beings who are going around and round in samsara that their negative actions are negative, that they will have harmful consequences. Even if they do realize this briefly, they do not keep it in mind, and hardly any of them put into actions the meanings for counteracting these negative actions. This is the very reason why they stay in samsara. So we have to make an effort to be acutely mindful of our actions and intentions and actions. You know, we really, with the teachings of the Buddha, it's a very empowering teaching because it basically tells us that we're going to be, we're in charge of what comes next through our actions and our choices. And of course, through the path, we have more freedom of choice. We have more free will as we practice. But between the two, you could say extremes that we have, eternalism and nihilism, the one disempowering view that somebody else is in charge of the universe, some creator, and another disempowering view is that our lives are meaningless, and this is a chaotic universe which just happens absolutely randomly and doesn't really matter what we do. Of the two, it's not that bad actually with the theistic views of the creator, because very often that comes with these practices of confession, the practice of going and purifying, lighting candles and so forth, and actually having some sense that may I do better. So that's not all that bad. But what really is negative is then the materialist view of thinking, well, what does it all matter what I do? We're just going to die and that's the end of it. So of the two, we would always say those who believe in something, they're naive, but those who believe in nothing, they're far worse. Actually, yeah. So, so that's where we have a very empowered situation with the teachings of the Buddha that definitely shows us how we have the power to shape our future. We need to first remember clearly which actions should be avoided and which should be carried out. And second, to observe whether or not we are acting in accordance with what we know to be right or wrong. So we have these two aspects. One is called mindfulness and the other is awareness. And so with awareness, we actually know what's to be done, and with mindfulness we then in every moment apply this insight, this awareness. In order to develop steadfast and diligent mindfulness, we have to realize that our present condition, our suffering in samsara, is nothing but the result of negative actions. If we do not stop these negative actions and just carry on as before, we will continue to experience suffering. By cultivating positive actions, words, and thoughts, we are earning our own happiness. Once we know this, we will naturally be alert and diligent in watching our minds. Is it painful when the mind separates from the body? Nature dungel is the word in Tibetan, and it's said to be painful. Some might not be conscious, people die in their sleep, and so forth. But this is the place where there's a moment of insight. into the everything is lost. There's no more familiar ground, and that's where great meditators they can recognize the primordial ground. But for most of us, that lasts very, very briefly, and we basically begin to then experience the content of our mind, and that's where the teachings like the Tibetan Book of the Dead teach us to constantly, or are intended to be reminders to come back to our practice. Then again, after a while, then we probably haven't, if we haven't recognized our mind, then we begin to look for a new rebirth. In his last teaching in Singapore, Songtse Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche was saying, enlightenment of all sentient beings is easier than building worldly asset. Is he coming from the fact that we are Buddha already, but we don't recognize? Yes. What we're doing with samsara is endlessly impossible. It's like, what is it? The Greeks have this myth of Sisyphus, the one who pushing the boulder up the mountain, and every time he's just about to reach the top, it falls back and he starts over again. And that's what samsara is, literally endless suffering. And so from the point of view of how much effort we have put into things in a samsaric sense, it's much easier to attain enlightenment. I think what people have gone through, just spectacular difficulties for goals that have no value. So if we put there, often they would say in the teachings, if we put even a fraction of that effort into the project of enlightenment, we would be enlightened in no time. Yeah. Okay. Suffering. This is it here. And again, remember one thing. In Buddhism, we're not saying life is suffering. That would be a bit like saying, everybody's sick. Like a doctor saying everybody's sick, and hence that's why a doctor is obsessed with sickness. Very often you say, "Oh, the Buddhists are so morbid; they talk about suffering and death." Not really. It's just that it's a curable condition. So we actually say that the deluded condition is suffering. As long as we're delusional, as long as we're afflicted, as long as we're dysfunctional and delusional, we suffer. Yeah. But life itself is not suffering. Life, the ground, the primordial ground is pure, blissful, all of that. The original condition is beyond duality, time, space, and so forth, and exists as the primordially blissful, permanent, naturally compassionate quality of enlightenment. That's the ground. That's what life is. But we don't have a life. We have a half-life. We have a shadow replica of life. And so we've diminished what was primordially expansive, pure, complete perfection. We've diminished that into a condition of suffering. And that's where we're cycling. And that's why we shouldn't fool ourselves, thinking that we could maybe eke out some little sort of bliss here. And that's why it's important to remember suffering. And that, of course, is the motivation in terms of the incentive for us to practice the path and also to understand the suffering of others. Khyentse Rinpoche says, what is the reason for cultivating virtue and avoiding non-virtue? It is the ordinary samsaric condition. In the ordinary samsaric condition, there's nothing but suffering. This is evident when we look at the various realms of samsara. Again, In modern life, we are generally not educated with an awareness of how mind creates the realms of samsara, unless we were brought up in a Buddhist culture. But even so, being brought up in a modern Buddhist culture, we're constantly actually in a very confusing position of being also taught the physics and the science of modernity. So that's where, unfortunately, even Buddhist cultures, then you'll have the idea that, well, believing in the realms of samsara is belief. That we can't really explain it, but that's how the lamas or the gurus, they teach it. And then we look at science, and they seem to be basing everything on something that's empirical. And that's why it's really important in modern Buddhist cultures that you can actually refute the position of science, and that you can actually establish the logic that is basic to the understanding of the mind and how it creates the realms of samsara. But but what we do have in the modern world actually is a lot of media that constantly brings in the bad news. People, they complain about not having that newspapers only bring bad news. Well, from a Buddhist point of view, that's very helpful actually, because that reminds us that samsara is suffering. So looking at the news and so forth, reading the newspapers, just seeing the frustration, not getting the party that you wanted elected in, and not, seeing the catastrophes there are around the world and so on. We have that. So we also have this ability to see the various realms of samsara, the sufferings of samsara. But now, specifically speaking, then, in terms of the reality of the 6 realms, we have the higher and the lower realms. The higher realms created by virtue, the lower realms created by non-virtue. The 3 lower realms, Khyentse Rinpoche says, are all conditions of the utmost misery. In the hell realms, as a result of anger and hatred, beings suffer unbearably from heat or cold. As a result of greed and miserliness, tortured spirits do not even hear of food or water for many years. Animals experience the fruit of stupidity, the lack of discernment between virtue and non-virtue. They are blind to the path of liberation and have no way of recognizing what will bring them happiness or suffering. Domestic animals are used as slaves and slaughtered for their meat and skin. So this you can see in greater depth in works like Jewel Ornament of Liberation, Words of My Perfect Teacher, and also presently we're looking at finding rest in the nature of mind. And despite the title, Finding Rest in the Nature of Mind, it also does talk about when we don't have rest. So it's the finding rest in the nature of mind is a lamrim. It takes us from the point of non-rest to rest. But we need to start off understanding the non-rest and where the mind gets itself into a place of suffering. So that's where we then have the incentive. Like, it's not like everything is just fine. It's not. Right now, as long as we have the foundations for suffering, suffering is extensive. So that's the lower realms. Then there are the realms of the human beings, demigods, and gods. These are called the 3 higher realms because the suffering there is less oppressive. Human beings have 8 different types of suffering. They suffer from birth, sickness, old age, and death. They suffer from when they meet enemies, part from friends, encounter circumstances they do not want, and are deprived of circumstances they like. Demigods, asuras, are constantly tormented by jealousy and animosity towards the gods or celestial beings, because the wish-fulfilling tree is rooted in their realm but bears its fruit in the realms of the gods. So this is we could say it's a metaphor, but either way, the situation is this intense jealousy that you're working. They're tending to this tree that grows up into the heavens, and they don't get the fruits because the gods, they come floating along and just pick the fruits, and hence the jealous gods are outraged of the injustice, and so they're battling the gods. When the demigods see the gods enjoying this fruit, and also the lakes of ambrosia and all the other perfect and pleasurable things they cannot have themselves, they burn with unbearable jealousy. They try to attack and fight the gods, but they are always defeated. Now, all of these descriptions of the various realms we could very well apply within our own experience. We do experience the 6 realms within our own life. Khyentse Rinpoche describes how we can go through a single day of experiencing these 6 realms. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, both in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, in Myth of Freedom, and also other places, describes how the 6 realms are experienced in terms of psychology, and identifies what kind of psychology lies at the basis of these realms. But we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that it's just psychology, just like we have in our human realm, the various experiences of the various realms. Chogyam Trungpa was initially teaching the jewel ornament of liberation, where he went into some depth about how these realms play out in terms of the manifestation of actual lifetimes. And his students, they were sort of coming from the materialist point of view, and also sort of a very common view in modernity, which is that kind of these views on the various realms, that's some sort of medieval or ancient view, and modern people don't think like that. So of course this is not so much to do with what's what or accurate science. It has more to do with just cultural baggage and the modern person thinking in particular ways that don't really take into account the experience of or rather the reality of the mind as the creator, cannot conceive of something like that. And it sounds just like old myths. So Trungpa Rinpoche very skillfully adopted his presentation of the 6 realms much more in terms of psychology. But we shouldn't think that it's just that this psychological pattern, as much as we can identify it in our present life, it's also something that follows us beyond this life and then creates these realms. So however much we can understand and identify and so on the specifics and the descriptions of the lower realms, that of course is there's no certainty. I think we can be clear on that. It's very individual, and we might have some reservations with some of the accurate descriptions, but that's almost secondary. The main point really is that we experience this self-perpetuating suffering of the lower realms, and also similarly we might have some temporary happiness in the higher realms, but all of it is limited by this delusional condition of self. And so while it's changing, we're still stuck in this cycle. So we can understand the causes of it on our immediate experience. So even the celestial beings, who seem to have everything one could desire, magnificent palaces and gardens, forests filled with flowers and birds, beautiful companions, delicious food, and so forth, are far from being beyond suffering. And this also we can see in our world, that those who might have everything are not necessarily that content. And even if they have this contentment, we can see it doesn't last. Once they have enjoyed these, the fruits of minor positive actions, and their karma has been exhausted, they will be reborn again in the most sorrowful states of samsara. So we often say the gods, because of the degree of their very evolved individuals, and some of them have prescience or clairvoyance, they will know where they will take rebirth. So they also have the great suffering then of knowing where they're going to be reborn. So this was the 4th contemplation. Let's just see if there's any questions. Please, can you post at the Dropbox or suggest an aspiration prayer. Okay, can you post an aspiration prayer traditional from the Khyentse lineage for our practice? Okay, I'll have to think. There's quite a few, and Khyentse lineage is a very big thing because it actually includes all all schools of Tibetan Buddhism. But anyway, I'll see if I can find something. Okay. How can the ground be compassionate if it is pure? Isn't compassion a learned condition? Oh no. Oh no. The compassion is something that very often is taught as something we should do. So from that point of view, we might think, oh, it's something we're applying. But that's a bit like when we do yoga and we're taught to sort of go into particular postures. But try and notice when we do that, we align ourselves with some innate condition. And so our whole being actually flourishes when we align ourselves. So like somebody said last time, compassion is already taking the fruit or the result or the primordial condition of the mind and making that a present experience. And also remember, the what we're realizing with enlightenment is the absence of self. And in the absence of self, where there is what we call selflessness, the natural condition is no longer limited to just me. It's like bursting this self-imposed little shell or bubble and emerging into something far greater that is a natural embracing of the other. So we would say the natural condition is compassionate, and there's none of these barriers between self and other. Trungpa Rinpoche talks about warmth without a central radiator. If demigods are not celestial beings, where do they abide? Well, I think we would want to stick with Chögyam Trungpa's understanding as this condition abides within the potential of our own mind. And of course, within Asian cosmology, we do attribute that these places give them a particular place. But I think since we can't really verify these with our modern instruments and so on, I think we should just really adopt the view that the six realms exists anywhere, but on the basis of psychological conditions. So, but basically demigods are beings that are well off, but still jealous that there's those that are even better off, and this feeling of injustice that they're working and then somebody else is exploiting their results. Would you please explain why birth is part of suffering? I have heard the explanation on this a few times before, but it just does not sink into my mind. Well, I guess as far as when we explain birth just in terms of the six realms and particularly the human realm, then it's really just the pain that the child goes through. And particularly in the 70s, when we begin to talk about natural birthing, it was very much with the recognition that children go through tremendously traumatic experience and the need to give them a sense of safety when they come out. And interestingly, one of the great people, the pioneers in this, what's his name again, the Frenchman? Oh, I forget his name. Anyway, this Frenchman, Le Boyer. Le Boyer. Le Boyer, he was a student of one Tibetan teacher, Khyentse Rinpoche, Tukupem Wangel and Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche's father. And it was from there actually that he got the idea, the understanding, when Khyentse Rinpoche explained to him the suffering of birth and what could be done, that he then began to understand that he developed the idea of making birthing less violent, because traditionally birthing could be quite tough in like modern hospitals and so on. But we would say that both mother and child go halfway to death. in birth, and some don't come out alive, but the child has to go through tremendous pain, and the mother as well. So probably go on YouTube and see if there's any videos there of women giving birth. In the West, many people are nursed in death laying flat. How can we best practice to prepare for death laying down when we are so used to adopting the position of sitting upright and being more alert? At the time of falling asleep, we're always saying actually that we should train in passing away, lying like the Buddha on our right side or left side with the hand under our head. This is called the lion's position. And that's regarded as a way of training in dying, lying down. Yeah. Some practitioners, they could sit straight up and doing powa, but that's a little bit unusual. So I think just practicing ourselves, and also at the time of falling asleep, then thinking, who knows if I'm going to be waking up again. And then also we can sometimes inverse this, so when we're practicing, we could say, when we wake up in the morning, we can say, oh, now I'm dying, now I've died. And this is all just a dream. This is all just Bardo phenomena. That's one way of training ourselves also. So egoification is suffering, definitely. Yeah, ego is suffering. And it's unnecessary suffering because ego doesn't actually exist. It's a delusional condition. In practicing the four contemplations, I often find the third and fourth contemplations sort of merging together. And a lot of overlap of material. Can you please define the differences of the similarities between these? Well, they're all kind of overlapping, but the emphasis is the fact of karma is that we have responsibility for our actions. So it's the empowering, and also the empowering sense of what we do, that we can do something, and also that we must do something. Suffering is just the overall recognition of the pain of samsara altogether. So the suffering of samsara is the foundation for the whole condition where we presently then have, luckily, a precious human rebirth, but we should remember it's impermanent, and we should remember that whatever we do, that's going to shape our experience. Do you think it could be interesting to us as a complementary studies to learn about the Bardos to increase the impermanence thought, or the wheel of life teachings for the suffering thought? Yeah, that's helpful. If you're doing ngöndro, I would always say make sure to mainly don't get too distracted by all sorts of studies. But yes, definitely, yeah. Learning about the Bible. In general, all these things are really helpful, and they give us a much wider perspective. Very good idea. Yes, study the Bardos, the wheel of existence teachings, and so on. Yeah. And yes, Le Boyer, Frédéric Le Boyer. Yeah. Okay. All right. No more questions? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. We have Khenpo Dorje visiting Sydney. I haven't met him yet, but I think he's beginning to teach tomorrow night. And by the way, these teachings are available on webinar. So Khenpo Dorje will begin tomorrow night. You can check the website, but the Heart Sutra for a few days. Yeah, in the evenings, Thursday and Friday, and then all of Saturday and Sunday. Heart Sutra. To be how do you say, broadcast as a webinar. What is a good antidote for Abrahamic guilt? It's insight into dependent arising and understanding Buddha nature. Simply just understanding the understanding the Buddhist view. The Abrahamic guilt is very much sort of with the notion of a creator. Here, it's very helpful as an antidote to understand causes and conditions. That's what shapes us, and hence we can do something about it. Also, this thing that we always say, the one good thing about negative actions done in the past is that they can be purified. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.